Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with someone whose work I'm relatively new to, but I am already in love. He's doing such important work in the world. His name is John Powell. He has recently written a book called The Power of Bridging: How to Build a World Where We All Belong, and he's here today to help us dip our toes into the waters a bit. So John, welcome to the podcast and thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for having me, Glenn. Look forward to talking to you.
Absolutely. So first things first, before we get into the book, since you're new to the show and people like myself, I might be new to you and your work, maybe tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, some of the big life events that brought you to the place you're at today.
When I hear that question, years ago, I went to India and I got quite sick.
Mm.
And my mom, who is a nurse, she's since passed. I came back home and I stopped in to visit her and my dad to convalesce. And so she nursed me back to health for about a week, and then she just got frustrated. And she said, "Why do you have to go to all these funny places? Why can't you just stay home like regular people?"
What's wrong with you?
And I said, "Mom, I'm trying to figure out who I am." And she said, "I know who you are." So uh, I have to talk to her since she's since passed. But I think, we have um, visions of ourselves and stories about ourselves, and um, they're not they're never quite true or complete. Um, so, um, but I'm six of nine children. These are
Mm.
some facts about me. I don't know, maybe give you some insight. I grew up in Detroit. My parents were sharecroppers. I was one of the first nine children born in Detroit. Lived in an area called Black Bottom, and it was what the name implies, basically a segregated community inside of Detroit. Um, and um, sort of started school before Brown v. Board of Education. So the country was in a different place, although it's in a different place again. Um, and my father was a minister. So I grew up in the church until I was 11, at which time I left because I had some concern for those who didn't hear the gospel, what would happen to them. Um, and I think in some ways, I think in leaving the church, that did something to me. But again, I'm not sure. So I think we all have multiple selves and sometimes they don't all cohere. Uh, but I think it put me on a road to search. Although another story is that I started searching before then. Um, I started reading very early and reading about people all over the world and trying to make sense of it. But once I left the church, that anchor was no longer available to me. So I went through I think, a pretty intense search. Um, and to some extent, I would say, while I think maybe we all search until we leave this place, the search has largely come quieted, I would say.
Mm.
Um, I feel fairly fortunate. I feel like I've had a good life. It's hopefully not over soon, but um, and wonderful friends and wonderful loves. So, and I recently, not recently, 13 years ago, moved to Berkeley and started. At the time, it was called the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society.
Mm.
People will not know the name Haas, but the Haas family is the Levi Strauss family. So if you wear blue jeans, you're probably wearing some aspect of them. And about 5 or 6 years ago, we changed the name to the Othering and Belonging Institute.
Mm.
It's a great institute. We work all over the world. We have about 120 professors involved and 60 or 70 staff. And we really cover the waterfront.
Mm.
Uh, so that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful. I mean, I read a little bit about um, that organization, and I'm just so intrigued by it because we live in such crazy and hectic times, and I feel like there's so much pull to stand on one side or the other, and you're doing this wonderful work that's aiming to bring people together, and I love it. So the one thing you talk about in the book about, and you just mentioned it, how when you were younger, you had a concern for people who didn't grow up the way you did in terms of your faith and religion and things like that. And I feel like for me, I can remember sitting in Bible college in an evangelism class and being the one who raised my hand to ask that kind of a question. Like, it doesn't seem fair that there's somebody in Africa or somebody in Asia who never even heard, of Jesus or, the Christian faith, and they're gonna go to hell. But me, I grew up in a place where there's a church in every corner. Like I couldn't not hear about it because it's always in my face. Like that just doesn't seem fair. And the answer was always, well, you just gotta believe and have faith that God will take care of it. I'm like, that just doesn't feel like a good enough answer for me.
Right.
Like if someone's eternal destination is on the line, it seems like that's just not an acceptable answer. And that was one of the many questions that kind of led me down this trail of asking what if there's other ways to think about these things. So
And
I guess looking at your book, John, I mean, the big question is, what is the goal of bridging this big word on the cover, and why is it so important in these times? And before maybe you talk about that, do you mind if I read a quote from the book?
not at all.
I have it up here on my screen. You have this statistic, and I actually had to read this a few times over the course of a couple of days because it really just blew my mind. But you say in 2022, an NBC News survey showed that 80% of people with political affiliations believed the other party poses a threat that, if not stopped, will destroy America as we know it. And then in 2023, a survey showed that 38% of people agreed with this statement. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. Clearly, I mean, we're at a crossroads when you look at those statistics. I mean, things seem to be headed in a not good direction. But reading your book and then kind of trying to engage with this work, which is very new for me, I think bridging can help. So maybe talk to us a little bit about what is bridging, why is it important, and most importantly, how can it help speak to and maybe begin to heal some of these wounds that these statistics seem to be magnifying.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Bridging, like a lot of terms, have many different meanings. Um, and the simple, logical meaning, intuitive meaning, is connecting people.
Mhm.
Mm. Connecting people suggests that there's a divide. And life is full of conflict. It's full of other things too, love, joy, uh, friends, family. But even within friends and family, there's conflict. One might say even within oneself, there's conflict. And we can run away from that conflict. We could act on it. Um, or we could also try to um, come to terms with it in a different way. And bridging is the latter. It's basically saying, okay, I don't maybe see things exactly like you do, but that doesn't mean I can't still care about you, um, pay attention to you. And so bridging is based on the notion of we are willing to extend our presence to someone and some things that we don't completely agree with,
Mhm.
which is in some ways a very modest request. Uh, the world doesn't have to be my oyster for me to actually engage with it.
Sure.
Um, and so bridging is basically saying, I'm willing to really listen, be present with you. And when I say listen, I don't mean listen just with the head, that's even possible, but also listen with the heart,
Mhm.
listen with feelings. Um, there's a South African word, sawabanu, which means, it's interpreted to mean, I see you.
Mhm.
It's also interpreted to mean, the God in me sees the God in you. Well, notice it doesn't say, I agree with you. It doesn't even say, I like you, but it says, I see you. And
Mhm.
the answer is, I am here. And so bridging is about seeing each other. Uh, and again, not agreeing with each other, not analyzing each other, not even figuring each other out, but fully being present with each other.
Mm,
Uh, and to fully be present also means to pay attention to the person's aspirations, to their joy, and even to their suffering.
mm,
And to suffer with another person is what compassion means, to suffer with. So that's what bridging is about. And there are many different things to support bridging, but it's not just a technique. It's really an intention, a presence, a curiosity about the other. And
mm.
like I said, the other can be aspects of ourselves. So so you can have bridging between people, between ourselves, between institutions, between groups, or not.
Mm. Yeah, when you talk about listening and seeing another person, I feel like one of the things I'm learning in my own journey is that there's a difference between listening to respond and listening to just listen. Because like in the past, I would have always said, "Oh, I'll listen to you," but while you're talking to me, especially if I don't agree with you, I'm analyzing in my head how I'm going to respond to build my argument to show you why you're wrong and I'm and I'm right, you know? And I feel like that's just how I was raised too, like in the church, especially in seminary, taking like apologetics classes and stuff, you're always preparing your argument. And I feel
Mhm.
like whenever I would listen to somebody, that's what I was always doing. But now I'm in this space where I'm kind of really challenging myself to, you know, be more curious, ask more questions before I make more statements. So if you're telling me something, and especially if I don't agree, let me ask a couple more questions to clarify what it is that you're saying and why it is that you think that way, because I feel like it's helping me realize that just as I have a story that helped me come to the beliefs and the values that I have, you have a story. And the guy down the street who has the Trump flag on his house, he's got a story. And that, for whatever reason, that story brought him to the place where he's at. And so, if I can better understand that, I think we can bridge that gap, like you say, a little bit.
So yeah, so when we carry stories, and stories are important, and we in some ways we can't but have stories, but we don't have to be completely attached to them in such a way that cuts off our ability to go beyond our story, to listen to someone else's story. Um, and sometimes, again, we approach another person without curiosity, as you said, with "I'm here to convince you of my point of view." I'm not really interested in your point of view, except to show you where it's wrong. Uh, so from that's a kind of listening. That's sort of a analytical listening.
Mhm,
There's a saying which is that the mind wants to be right, the heart wants to be in relationship.
mhm.
Of course, both are important in some respect, but we spend too much time in the mind looking for ways to show the other person where they're wrong and where we're right.
That's right. That's right. So, one of the things that has drawn me to your work, and I'd love if you could respond to this a little bit, if you don't mind me sharing some of my personal story with you.
I'm not,
Um, but this doesn't have to be anybody else's story, especially for our listeners. Like, you don't have to be on this path that I'm on, but this is just kind of where I'm at. But I grew up in as I said earlier, a very conservative, evangelical world where we othered everyone who was different than us. You know, the atheists and the Democrats, even the church down the street who maybe understood the atonement differently than we did, like they were wrong, as well. And the energy always, man, I didn't feel it then, but looking back on it, I can put more words on it. It was very angry, right? It was very angry, judgmental, shameful, very fearful of them and fearful of those people who are going to lead us astray, and even sometimes borderline hateful in a lot of ways. But then I started to rethink my life, and I told you before we hit record about that incident with my in the NICU with my daughter, and I started to rethink a lot of different things. And I left that conservative world and I stepped into a more progressive world where we value, inclusion and diversity and all these wonderful ideas. But during the election season, especially, and I say probably started thinking about this back in maybe about a year ago, maybe like last February or March, I started to realize like, wait a minute, like I'm just as angry as I used to be. I'm just as, in a lot of ways, I'm just as judgmental. There's times where I feel like I really hate, MAGA.
mm,
Um, just as I once hated the Democrats. Like I'm just as fearful of Trump as I used to be of Obama. I
Mhm.
say I believe in inclusion, but that doesn't really include people who think very differently than I do. And I had this thought that like I'm becoming the same energy on the
Mhm.
left that I wanted to leave behind when I left the right. And so I started to reach out and explore, these other ways to be and other ways to hold my progressive values. I think the values I have are good, but I really want to ask myself, like, in what ways am I holding them and am I sharing them? And are those the best ways to hold them and share them? Can I hold them in a way that I recognize, like you said, the humanity in all people and be curious about stories of other people, ask more questions than I make statements? And so that led me to your books. That's given me so much to think about, and you've put so many words on ideas that are swimming around in my head. So I wanted to share that story with you, because I think some of our listeners are in a similar spot. So I've heard, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts that you'd want to respond with that.
Well, I think first of all, thanks for sharing. I appreciate it. That's a beautiful story, and it's a story full of wisdom. And I think it is, and part of wisdom is being able to reflect back on ourselves
Mhm.
and learn. Not waiting for the world to sort of catch up to us. Um, and also, it sounds like you're ready to really uh, expand how you think about inclusion.
Yep.
It's like I'll include everybody that agree with me. Well, that's pretty easy. Uh,
Right.
and that's not what the world is calling for. Um, and so inclusion, and in this case, bridging, doesn't mean that you give up your values. It doesn't mean you abandon your beliefs, but it means you make room for others. And it does mean in some ways you're willing to question, that you're willing not just to question the other, but to question yourself. Um, and at some point, when you say, I care about someone, when you say, I love someone, when you say, I'm empathetic to someone, again, it's not because they agree. Uh, that's not what bridging is calling for. That's not what we talk about belonging is calling for. It's calling for something else. Um, and, and many of those concepts are very deeply rooted in Christian faith as well as the Muslim faith, as well as the
Mhm.
Buddhist faith, if you can call it a faith. Buddhism is not really a faith-based religion. Um, when Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, I have been the rapist, I have been the murderer, I have been all those things that I have bore. That's part of who I am. Um, but when Jesus said, love thy enemy as thyself, love thy enemy as thyself. Who's your enemy? Uh, Whoever that is, can you love them?
Mhm.
So that's really what it's calling for. And sometimes we just blithely skip over those words. Oh, yeah, I read that.
Mhm.
Now get this person off my house, out of my neighborhood.
Yeah.
So the teaching is there, I think but it's also here.
Mhm.
What does it mean for us today in 2025 in the United States?
Right.
Um, and most of the time, when we have the other, the enemy, he, she, they are a caricature. We actually don't know much about them. You may know they don't agree with us on this issue or that issue, on the environmental issue, on whatever. But we don't know that much about them.
Mhm.
Uh, and we tell a story about them instead of listening to their story.
Mhm.
Uh, there's a famous experiment where they're looking at a person who's homeless and they have the viewer hooked to some terminals and they say, um, because they're measuring the brain patterns. When you deeply other someone, um, the brain patterns are different.
Mhm.
When we see another human being, we actually, there's part of the brain that lights up. When you deeply other someone, that part of the brain does not light up. We literally, at an unconscious level, don't see the other as human. Not just being wrong, they're not human. And so we
Mhm.
don't accord them human dignity and respect. So they're having someone look at someone who's being deeply othered, that part of the brain is being quiet. And then they ask, what kind of vegetables do you think that person likes? And just that question causes part of the brain that recognizes other humans to completely light up.
Wow.
You know, that person likes vegetables?
Mhm.
I never thought about them like that. How I thought about them was that they disagree with me on this, or So, and there are a lot of techniques like that, but this is beyond just techniques. But so you absolutely, you came to that, I think, in a organic way. But the most important things, you came to it,
Mhm.
and living that out will be challenging for you.
Mhm.
You have to probably learn it over and over and over again. But that's your learning edge.
Mhm.
Uh, that's potentially exciting.
Yeah. And what I'm finding challenging too, and I'm sure you've encountered this, is that the progressive circles I'm in, especially when somebody who has a podcast like I have, and I write blogs and stuff, and there's a lot of pressure to uh, conform to the some of the more popular progressive approaches to conversations regarding politics, and there's a lot of pressure to, slam certain people and to flip over tables, like Jesus did, and to do all these different things. And when I'm voicing that I believe I have these values, but I'm trying to hold them differently, and I'm trying to have these conversations with people and understand their stories, there's a lot of pushback where I
Mm.
feel like, in a way, I've almost been othered, so to speak, along with the people who my group is othering, because it's like, well, you're not going to be one of us. Like, there's a problem with you. And somebody actually emailed me and called me a special kind of vile because I want to have these kind of conversations. And I'm like, I shared, because I was reading your book, and I shared that story of that research that was done with the brain and the person, the people, the part of the brain lighting up that didn't see a person but saw felt disgust. And I said, I have to ask myself, like, am I okay with a with allowing my brain to not see someone as human? Like, am
Mm.
I okay with seeing somebody who, I adamantly disagree with, but my brain lighting up with disgust as opposed to a human being? And am I okay with that happening, especially when I call myself a follower of Christ in this way, that Jesus put forth? Like, I feel like there's a disconnect there. I feel like I've got to address that. Like, I can't, that doesn't sit well in my spirit to be able to just go on with my life knowing that that's the way. And so I want to explore this different way, and that's just where I'm at.
No, I think it's really important. My father was a Christian minister, uh, and one interpretation of the word Christian is Christ-like.
Hmm.
And I would say, without judging people, that's not my role or my prerogative, but I would say, if you want to be Christ-like, be Christ-like. And I, from the little time I spent reading the Bible and studying the Bible, uh, most of the people walking around here are not Christ-like. Uh, my guess is that Jesus's brain was not othering anyone.
Yeah.
Uh, and it doesn't mean that he didn't get upset. Obviously, did, and the money laundering. But the teaching that he brought was that we're all children of God.
Mhm.
It wasn't that we're all children except those four people that I can't stand. Um, but we have to come to this through our own life, because some of
Right.
us will go through the Christian faith, some through the Islamic faith, some through the Buddhist, some through atheists, some through the love of the planet. Uh, but I would say wherever your boundaries stop, that's where your work begins.
That's right.
Um, and to your point, and I think I mentioned this in the book, a friend of mine and colleague who died a couple of years ago, Bell Hooks, she used to say that bridges are made to walk on. And by that, she meant that if you decide to become a bridger, and I have a hat saying bridger, I think of myself as at least trying to be a bridger. But if you become a bridger, that is, if you're reaching out to whomever is designated as the other, you're likely to invite hostility from your own group.
Yeah.
As part of the way we make a group is by creating the other.
Yeah.
Um, and so when you reach out, you're in some sense challenging some aspect of the group. Um, and that's one reason that people don't bridge more often, because there's sometimes a cost exacted on us when we bridge.
Yeah.
I talk in the book about how David Brooks, whom I met a few times, he talks about, as a conservative, being open to and reaching out to people who are not conservative he's become isolated, even though he's a New York Times writer. Uh, he's becoming isolated because he's trying to extend a bridge. In fact, he started a group called the Weavers, weaving people together.
Mm.
Um, and yet, when we don't bridge, and in fact, when we do the opposite of bridging, which is called breaking, we not only threaten the other, we threaten the entire society. And then we build edifices and policies and practices and to actually justify it. We actually become um, the very opposite of Christian in my mind. We become the Antichrist in some ways.
Mm.
And we cut ourselves off from ourselves. So there's real harm to the breaking. And we're seeing that harm play out, not just in the United States, but around the world.
That's right.
So, but I think for your listeners and for you, I hope everyone will at least seriously think about becoming a bridger, but being aware that it's not easy.
Yeah,
You may, in fact, be pushed away, but hopefully you won't push people away.
that's right.
Uh,
That's right. Yeah, I was talking to somebody else on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and they had said that they read a book where the person was talking about the idea of bridging, but they talked about the idea of like no man's land. And sometimes as a bridger, you step into this space where you're going to get fired at by both sides because you're in a space where you're trying to reach across, to both sides, and that can be a scary place to be. It's the opposite of trying to not rock the boat. You're getting into the middle where you're rocking both sides of the boat. But I thought that was a really good way to put it. You talk in the book about, one of the aspects of your work, and which I thought was really interesting and helpful, is that you focus on othering as opposed to only the harms of racism and how racism is not necessarily the same as othering, but it's one of the many avenues through which othering creates harm in the world. And so I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about the differences and similarities of othering and racism and why your emphasis is on that term othering.
a great question. So in the United States, obviously race is part of the one of the third rails, uh, given our history, given where we are today, given our laws. Is that and it was 1967 before it was legal for there to be interracial marriage in much of the country, which is not that long ago.
It's
The laws
mind-boggling that that's like it feels like I wasn't even alive then, but still to hear 1967 just feels like yesterday.
exactly. So
Yeah.
it wasn't just feelings. It was like we actually had created this complex arrangement in our society uh, around race. So race is important and continues to be important. And the research in the mind science actually reflects that. But it's not everything. So as you suggested, racism and race is one way we can say someone's the other.
Mm.
So when we talk about whether it's one group being better than the other, one person being the other better than the other because of their race, because of their color, that's an expression of racism. But we also can express it through zoning,
Mm.
which is not necessarily personal antipathy. It's actually creating a structure, and we can rationalize it. So if you look at some of the cases that, like Plessy versus Ferguson, they talked about keeping the public peace by keeping the races separate.
Mm.
So sort of a benign racism, right?
Mm.
Um, but it's also saying this group is the other. In fact, in some of the extreme cases, they said the idea that black blood would pollute white blood. We hear this language of polluting the country again. So it's saying the other somehow will pollute this purity, this otherwise pure white society. Uh, but the concept is not really race at all. The concept is othering. So if you think about the untouchables or daylights in the Indian caste system, one of the reasons they're the untouchables is because they actually literally clean up cow manure.
Mm.
Uh, so they're considered dirty, that they would defile the Brahmins. And so that same concept of the other. Uh, and then you look at places like Rwanda, when the genocide happened there, they talked about the outside group as being beast, as being Brahmins, as being comparing them to insects. So what I'm saying is that the process of othering happens across the country, across the world, and people use different substitute in different things. Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's
Hmm.
language, sometimes it's the way people eat. And then there's soft kinds of othering, the othering where oftentimes men or males do to women. Uh, so they don't necessarily commit genocide against the women. Generally, society can't do that. Or
Hmm.
it will repopulate. Uh, but they consign them to a certain place. They consign them to a place where they're not fully human.
Hmm.
So in the United States, right, women weren't allowed to vote until 1920. Uh, so women were accepted on some level, but it was less than a man.
Hmm.
Uh, and so we have all these expressions of others, and we can invent new ones almost every day. There are more uh, people with disabilities than there are blacks or Latinos in the United States.
Hmm.
For years, we said the disabled was, in some ways, even the term is problematic, but this disabled are less than. Uh, there was a period of time where we literally called for people being aborted if we knew the fetus was going to be disabled. So they were, again, kind of other. Uh, um, so you go around the world, and there's some societies that you can never vote unless you're part of a certain religious faith.
Hmm.
And we're using religion to say, if you're not of my faith, it's not simply I don't like you, it's that you can't be a full member of society.
Hmm.
There's certain countries where you can't, the head of the country have to be of a certain faith. So these all these expressions. And so race is one expression, but so can our ability, so can our age,
Hmm.
so can our, height, so can our gender. Um, and so again, we're just clever in all the ways that we other people. Rwanda was one of the worst genocides in the 20th century. Um, a lot of people obviously have heard of Germany, but more people have not heard of Rwanda. One of the things they used to other people were the number of cows you own.
Hmm.
So if you didn't have the requisite number of cows, you were not fully human.
Hmm.
Now, that sounds ridiculous because it is. And so the othering process ultimately is not about the other, it's about the social interpretation of meaning we put on the other.
Hmm.
Not the other's race or gender or sexual orientation is really a problem. It's the social story. We talked about stories earlier that we tell about the
Hmm.
other. And so if you don't have 5 cows, you're a bad person. That's
Hmm.
my story, right? It's like, why that story? I don't know, just the one that was convenient today.
Hmm.
But it becomes this, once it becomes rooted in society, even as a story, the reality of it, the impact of it becomes very significant in terms of how long you live, in terms of how you thrive, in terms of where you live, in terms of who your friends are. So part of it is to understand this process in a much larger way, um, and and to really challenge it. And we've made some progress, but we sometimes just focus on the narrow aspect of it. By narrow, I mean like this gender, race, and also all these things can be combined. Uh, the, the, the other thing that's just sort of somewhat counterintuitive that a group that's other can turn around and other another group.
Yeah.
So a group can be marginalized because of some aspect, but then turn around and marginalize another group. Uh, so there's some complexity and nuance to this. But if we understand the structure of it, we think it's a better chance of actually addressing it at a more fundamental level.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mean, the way when I was reading the book, I was thinking, trying to process this idea of, racism being an avenue of othering because especially in the progressive world, racism is a very big topic and it can be very easily you can just assume, that racism is othering and there aren't really any other aspects of othering. And I feel like when I was reading your book, I'm like, this idea is really making more room at the table for more stories because I've often felt, I mean, look at me, I'm the I identify I'm the poster child for privilege. I'm a white male I'm straight, and I grew up in a very affluent area in northern New Jersey. And whenever I talk about different things regarding being othered, I've gotten like the eye rolls, like, what, how could you possibly, what could you possibly know about being othered? You're the most privileged person that there, kind of person that there is. And it's true. I would never know what it's like to be a black man. I never know what it's like to be LGBTQ and have to live with, those things and being able to how other people respond to it. I have no idea.
Mhm.
But, I grew up in the evangelical world, like I said, and when I made that decision to ask questions, it did not go over well. I mean,
Mhm.
I lost friends, lifelong friends, church friends. There's family members that we haven't talked to in 6 or 7 years who, don't want nothing to do with us because of the questions that we asked regarding things like hell and things like the rapture and all these different things. And, so although my experience is very different from someone like yours, I have I have a story to share regarding being othered. And I think that when we make more room at the table for people who have been othered due to racism, othered due to their sexuality, due to their religion, we hear more experiences of people. And I think that we can become better bridge builders because I feel like the more stories that we have to draw from people's experiences, the more we can say, oh yeah, that's something I didn't think about. What can our conversation look like in regards to a person who's experienced that or someone who's othering somebody because of that reason. And I feel like the more stories we have, the bigger our tool belt gets to build that
Right.
unity that we're looking for.
That's really important. So everybody suffers,
That's right.
uh, and I cite in the book Bob Marley because he has one of his songs, to paraphrase it, says, "Every person thinks his burden is the heaviest."
Mm,
So we tend to know our own stories of struggle, our own stories of disappointment, having lost our favorite aunt when we were 10 years old, uh, or our sister uh, being injured in an accident and having to drop out of school to help out with the family. I
mm,
mean, we all have stories and they cut across, and they're not all the same. I mean, systematic attack on a group is different than a personal story, but it's still a story.
right,
They're both stories. We all suffer. And and so I think we have to be careful as we try to correct and change the projection of lives of people who are systematically marginalized, that we don't end up marginalizing somebody else, including the straight white privileged man. Um, I've gone all over the world, um, and I have all kinds of privilege. It's not privilege itself that's the problem; it's how it's used. There's some studies showing that in the United States, for a man, every inch over 6 feet over your lifespan, you make your average $150,000.
mm.
So I'm 6'3". So you do the math, right? I mean, uh, but really pointing to is that there's privilege in our society associated with height.
Yeah.
Uh, and I'm a little taller. I didn't do anything to be taller. Um, and and I might not even notice height privilege, but it's there.
Mm,
It doesn't make me a bad person. So you're being white or growing up in an affluent neighborhood doesn't make you a bad person.
mm,
And it doesn't actually save you from suffering. Uh, it may not be the same suffering that someone who grows up poor and homeless, but you both can suffer.
yeah.
And so part of it is the ability to actually see people suffer. And as you said, everybody belongs to the table as a
Mm,
full member. Uh, Everybody has a story. And so what bridging invites us by listening to your story. You shared with your daughter being born. It's a heart-wrenching story. It's a beautiful story.
mm,
Um, so what bridging does is invite those stories into the discourse, everybody's stories. I'm not saying my story is more important than your story, which too often, especially in the context of progressive social justice work, we oftentimes insist that there's some stories that are more important. Now, it is true that some stories get silenced. So if you're marginalized, it's harder for you to get your story out.
mm,
It's harder to get society to listen to your story. But in the effort to get your story out, and be listened to, it doesn't mean not listening to other people's stories or quieting their stories either.
Mm, that's right. Yeah, that's so good. What would you be, last question for you, what would your advice be for somebody who's listening to us talk and they're maybe a progressive leaning person? They have very strong values and ideas regarding things that are going on in the world right now. Um, they work a 9 to 5 job. They're trying to pay the bills. They're just trying to make it to the next day. But they're maybe feeling that feeling inside that we spoke of earlier, that there's got to be another way to hold these things. What are some practical ways that an everyday person can go about beginning to be a bridge builder in their communities, even in their families, right? Because in families, it's often where sometimes the biggest gaps can be when you have different family members who believe different things. Like, what are just some practical ways to start doing that, and maybe even to, instill that in their children? Because I think of my daughter who's 7, and even she comes home now saying that so and so, you know, said that, Donald Trump is the best, but this person said Donald Trump is the worst, and this person says they hate Joe Biden. Like, she's getting all these different things in school in second grade where she's hearing these different kids say different things and she's seeing the divide. So, what are some practicalities that people can bring into their lives?
It's a great question, Glenn. So, a couple of things. I think this should be taught in every school, from elementary, maybe even preschool, up through graduate school. Uh, I teach at Berkeley, which is a wonderful school. Uh, we have one of the best engineering departments in the world, and we're doing bridging work, but it's not part of the curriculum.
Mm.
And yes, that'd be great for us to help develop a new iPhone or AI. But the problem, I think, is, can we actually relate to each other as humans? That's the challenge the world is facing. The world's not facing the challenge of, we need a new watch, right?
We got
Uh,
enough.
not watch, not watch. So, um, but the opportunity to bridge, and there are some things that can be learned. I would encourage people to go to our website, Other and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. There's our colleagues at Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley. There's a group of several different groups, conservatives, liberals, and otherwise, called the New Pluralists. So there are all these things available. Now there are hundreds of groups who are reaching, trying to help people bridge. There's actually a bill that's being considered in the House that has half Democrats and half Republicans sponsoring it, to actually bring bridging into our public discourse.
Mm,
Uh, all those things are available and more. But I say to people when they ask, what should I do? How do I start? I say, start from where you are, not from where you want to be.
mm,
Um, and start with short bridges. Don't start with the most difficult situation you can imagine. Uh, I use the analogy that if you have been sitting on the couch for the last 2 years and you decided, okay, I'm going to run a marathon, great, you know, but start by just walking around the block.
mm.
Don't go out tomorrow and try to run 13 miles.
Right.
Uh, well, don't try the most difficult things. So work with short bridges. And what are short bridges? There are people who you share already a lot. They may be family members who you share language, history, food, culture. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, because even for short bridges, they can be very intense and very hard. Uh, but don't start with the most difficult. So start with something small, uh, and be intentional. And so I was talking to a friend recently. He was telling me about, he hasn't, he can't relate to his niece, as one of his, used to be a favorite niece, because she's gone in a different political direction than she has. And he says he felt like writing her and saying, so what do you think about this now? Like sticking a finger in her eye. I
Mm,
said, that letter. It's because, first of all, it's not curious. You're really poking at her. You're asking a rhetorical question. Ask her real questions.
mm,
And don't start necessarily with the most difficult. Just ask her, how you doing?
mm.
How's your cat? What do you think about school? I miss you. Could we have coffee together? You know, um, and after you sort of reestablish trust, and what trust is about, it's not simply that, again, someone agree with you, is that you won't take advantage of each other.
Mm.
You won't gratuitously hurt each other. Um, and so if I open up to you and I'm vulnerable to you, you won't use it against me. So trust is a big part of bridge building. And one of the things that happens when we break, we not only tell bad stories about each other, we don't trust each other anymore. Uh, and as Robert Putnam has said many times, that society can't really function where the trust level, where the social capital is eroded. Uh, and we need to do it at an individual level, but as Levy says, we also need to do it at an institutional level. So what are institutions in our community and our society that we could use to help us with this? So it becomes easier. Because what institutions do, they regularize things. You know, I don't have to think about driving home. They have streets, they have street lights, they have stop signs. I just have to sort of follow those. Um, so if those things don't exist, it takes more time and energy. So whether it's our schools, our church, our bowling league, uh, having a meal, is there something we can do where we collectively bring together something and then regularize
Mm.
it? So I think once someone starts on the journey, they'll find out. It's like looking for a yellow Volkswagen. We start looking, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So you have to start looking and be intentional.
That's right. Yeah, I think that, I mean, my biggest takeaway from the book is that, well, one of my biggest takeaways is just that when it comes to being a bridge builder, s- you don't have to start with the hottest topic that's on the plate because, I could sit down with somebody who I know has very different political beliefs than me, but the bridge doesn't necessarily have to start with that conversation. It can start with, tell me about your new cat that you got, or tell me about, how your family's doing. I hear your son just went to college. How's he doing? Like those conversations, like you said, begin to build that bridge. And so there becomes a point where it might feel safer to have that more difficult conversation down the road. And you both might be at a different place to have the conversation because you've already done a little bit of that work to build some kind of a bridge. And I think that so often we feel that pressure to have to jump right into the heated conversation and right into the heat of the battle. And in reality, that does a lot more harm than it does good a lot of times.
I'll just end, Glenn, with two things.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a concept of sacred symbols.
Hmm.
So part of bridge building is paying attention to each other's sacred symbol. Most of us don't really know what the other sacred symbol is, although we may have an idea. But sometimes we denigrate the sacred symbols. So you want to have a cross, yeah, bad, uh, you want to have whatever. Uh, so can we flip that? Can we be curious about each other's sacred symbol? And what makes a symbol sacred is that part of our self, part of our soul, part of our spirit is embodied in that symbol.
Hmm.
Uh, and sometimes we have secular sacred symbols. Like I used to teach at the Ohio State University, and football was a secular sacred. A town of, half the town will go to the football games. And I remember when I was being interviewed, and one of the people, I think it was the provost, asked me, "So, do you like football?" I said, "Not really." He said, "Wrong answer." Uh, but we can pay attention to what you care about. If
Yeah.
you like something, can I actually ask you about it? Uh, and I have a good friend who visited me and my dad years ago, and he's an atheist. But my dad's a Christian, and he asked my dad. They had an hour-long conversation about the Bible, uh, and it built something beyond information about the Bible. It built a connection between them. And I really respected my friend. His name is Paul, uh, because he, on one hand, one could say he was not interested in the Bible. On the other hand, one could say he's interested in the Bible because of my dad.
Mm.
He was interested in my dad, and he's willing to let his interests, his sacred symbols, rise to the top.
Mm. That's so good. The sacred symbols of another, right? So good. So good. John, we're just about out of time, but this has been so much fun. I appreciate your time with us. I appreciate your work. Thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you.
And real
Keep
quick, where can people go if they want to interact more with you online or your work? Do you have any websites you want to direct us to or?
Sure. If you go to OBI or
Mhm.
Belonging and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, uh, so pull it up very quickly. But you can find me there, but you can also find tons and tons of work. And we always having conferences and video chats. So, um, and of course, otheringbelonging.berkeley.edu, that'll bring it up. But if you just type in Othering and Belonging Institute in your web browser, it'll bring it up. And
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I will put the links to all the things in the show notes, and maybe we can do this again sometime.
I would like that.
Thank you.